Life stories. They arrested the wrong guy and paid the price, a shocking courtroom revelation. They thought they were just arresting another guy who fit the description, but when he showed up in court the next day, not in cuffs, but in a tailored suit, they realized they'd made the worst mistake of their careers. It was just after 9 a.m. when the call came through dispatch. Black male, mid-30s, navy jacket, suspected in a vehicle break-in on Madison Avenue. Officers Jason Walker and Emma Green were cruising down the block in their patrol car, sipping coffee and half listening to the chatter. They exchanged a glance like it was just another easy arrest. "There he is," Jason muttered, nodding toward a man standing outside the bustling Central Cafe, one of the busiest spots in downtown Portland. The man, calm and collected, was flipping through something on his phone, a croissant in one hand. He matched the description loosely, and that was enough for them. Jason parked fast, no lights, no sirens. Emma was already out of the car before it even came to a full stop. "Hey, hands where I can see them," she shouted. The man, Derrick Thompson, looked up, startled but not panicked. "Excuse me," he asked, puzzled. "I'm just standing outside a cafe." "You fit the description of a suspect," Jason added, stepping closer, his hand hovering near his holster. "I'm waiting for my friend," Derrick replied calmly. Emma rolled her eyes. "We'll sort it out at the station." Before Derrick could respond, Jason grabbed his arm and spun him around. "You're resisting," he declared, loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Phones began popping up in the crowd. Derrick didn't resist. He just looked down at the sidewalk, accepting the cuffs without saying another word. As they tightened the cuffs, Emma smirked. "Funny how they always get mouthy until they see the cuffs." "Probably another guy with a fake LinkedIn page and a made-up resume," Jason added, laughing as they walked him to the patrol car. They didn't read him his rights. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't check his phone or the bag that clearly had a receipt inside. They just shoved him into the back of the cruiser and pulled away, already cracking jokes about the report they'd have to file later. Inside the cruiser, Derrick stared ahead, silent. Jason glanced over his shoulder. "You got anything to say?" Derrick's voice was calm. "I want my phone call." Jason made a face. "You'll get it after booking." But something in Derrick's tone, measured, patient, almost indifferent, struck Jason enough to glance back at him again through the rearview mirror. Derrick wasn't scared. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't done either. The booking process was slow. The desk officer, a guy named Alex Palmer, blinked twice when he saw Derrick being walked in. Guys, you sure about this one?" he asked. Jason waved him off. "Fits the call. Car break-in, loitering outside a cafe with a pastry bag and a phone," he explained. Emma stepped in. "You doubting a field call?" Alex frowned, hesitated, and then processed Derrick's information. He did a double take when he saw the screen, looking up with an expression of disbelief. Derrick remained calm. "I'd like my phone call now," he requested again, his voice gentle but firm. Jason raised his eyebrows. "Who you got call? Lawyer?" "No," Derrick said. "The Attorney General's office." Jason laughed. "Sure, tell him we said hi." They walked away, but Alex Palmer wasn't laughing. He was still staring at the screen, his fingers frozen on the keyboard. That's when everything started to shift. What Jason and Emma couldn't see was just how far out of their depth they already were. The holding cell was cold. Not freezing, but that kind of steady cold that sinks into your wrists when you're still cuffed. Derrick sat on the bench, not slouched, but not stiff either, just steady. His clothes were sharp, even in jeans and a jacket, polished boots, clean lines. Everything about him screamed control, even now. Down the hall, Jason leaned against a vending machine, cracking open a soda like it was just another day at the office. "Just see the look on his face?" he asked Emma, "like he thinks he's above it all?" Emma took a sip of her coffee. "That type always does. Shows up in the nice part of town, starts acting like rules don't apply. Same script." Jason chuckled. "My favorite is when they start talking about lawsuits and badges like we haven't heard that one before." Neither of them noticed the man from Internal Affairs walking past the front desk, or the fact that Alex Palmer had stepped away from his post and was talking on a secured line in a back office. Back in the holding area, Derrick was finally granted his call. He didn't fumble for a number, didn't scroll through his phone. He simply dialed.
This is Thompson. Portland PD, Madison Avenue incident. I'll need everything by this afternoon." He hung up. No anger, no noise, just a clean break. The call lasted under 30 seconds, but that was all it took.
When Jason saw him again, it was in the corridor. Not in cuffs, not behind a door, but walking past them calmly, flanked by two state officials in suits. Jason blinked like the light had suddenly changed. "That's not possible," he muttered. Emma narrowed her eyes. What the hell is going on? Alex Palmer was watching from his desk, but he didn't say a word. He just typed something into a system they didn't have access to. Derrick didn't glance back at them. He didn't throw any looks or smirks. He simply walked out with the same steady pace he came in with. And the silence he left behind was heavier than any siren that night. That evening, Jason had dinner with his brother and ranted about people with connections. He called it favoritism, said it reeked of politics. Emma sat on her porch, sipping a beer with her girlfriend. She brushed it off, convinced it was some city hall mix-up and the guy would eventually get slapped with a record. "Nobody walks around that smooth without hiding something," she said. But as the week went on, the whispers inside the department started to spread. Someone mentioned Derrick's name during a briefing and two sergeants exchanged a look. One officer mentioned he used to work in Oakland and was high up in some watchdog group. Even Captain Rollins started acting differently. Short with his answers, more careful with his wording when Derrick's name came up. That got Jason nervous. If command was spooked, that meant something real was in play. Emma brushed it off, as usual. We got body cams, we got the call log, we were following protocol. Jason nodded, but it felt forced. His stomach was twisting a little. Something about Derrick didn't add up, not in the way they expected. And the way he left with no drama wasn't how the guilty moved. Still, they went back to work like nothing had changed, but the truth was already moving faster than they could keep up with, because by the time they felt the floor shifting beneath them, Derrick was already standing on higher ground, watching everything unfold. The courthouse in downtown Portland wasn't grand or intimidating, just concrete steps, glass doors, and the echo of shoes down wide hallways. Jason and Emma walked in side by side, both dressed in their sharp blue uniforms with polished badges. No smiles, just routine. They had done courtroom appearances more times than they could count. The charge read simple: obstructing investigation of stolen vehicle. They expected Derrick to show up late, probably with a lawyer in tow. Maybe he'd try to turn it into a spectacle. But Derrick wasn't outside. He wasn't in the waiting area. He wasn't even listed on the docket as a typical defendant. As they passed the security checkpoint, a bailiff approached them with a stiff nod. "You two are testifying in courtroom 3B? "Yeah, Walker and Green," Einstein said, glancing at Emma. "This is the Thompson case." The bailiff blinked. "Thompson's not the defendant." Jason frowned. "Come again?" The bailiff simply pointed down the hall. "You'll see when you get there." When they entered courtroom 3B, everything felt off. Not chaotic, not loud, but different. The room was full, not with the usual crowd of nervous defendants and annoyed lawyers, but with journalists, 2 camera crews, and someone from the city council. Jason's neck stiffened as his eyes locked on the front table. There, seated beside the judge, was Derrick Thompson. No cuffs, no defense attorney, just a man in a dark, tailored suit, calmly flipping through a binder. A nameplate in front of him read, "Special Counsel for Civil Accountability, State of Oregon." Emma leaned in. "What is this?" Jason whispered back. "I don't know." This wasn't in the case notes. The judge called the room to order. "Today's session concerns a procedural review regarding conduct during a recent arrest on Madison Avenue," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Thompson will serve in an advisory capacity representing the state's Civil Accountability Office." Emma's jaw twitched. Jason looked like he'd been slapped. Without warning, Derrick didn't look their way, not once. He simply sat back, the judge turning to the front bench.
Officers Walker and Green, please approach. They moved stiffly, no longer in control. Every eye in the room was on them, but not the kind they were used to. This wasn't admiration, it was scrutiny. The judge asked, "Can you walk us through the reasoning behind your decision to detain Mr. Thompson?" Jason cleared his throat. "We received a dispatch call. Black male, navy jacket. Mr. Thompson had no prior criminal record." The judge interrupted. "No history with your department?" Jason paused, fumbling. "No, ma'am." "ID checked before detainment?" Emma replied, "He fit the description and didn't comply when we gave commands." Derrick didn't look up, but he did click his pen once, slow and deliberate. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Thompson, do you have any clarifying points?" Derrick's eyes met theirs for the first time. "In my line of work," he began, his voice steady, "I've read hundreds of reports that start the same way. Vague descriptions, unchecked assumptions. And over time, those patterns tell a story. The badge doesn't protect you from that." Emma opened her mouth to interrupt, but Derrick raised a finger, not to her, but to the judge. "I'd like to enter a motion to suspend direct testimony today. Internal review has been authorized. A hearing will follow in 2 weeks." The courtroom went still. The judge nodded, granted. Jason and Emma didn't say a word. They stepped back, numb. Derrick gathered his binder, closed it quietly, and stood. He didn't look triumphant, he didn't gloat, but his presence was heavier than any argument they could have made. As he walked out, the press followed.
Jason's hands were shaking. Emma whispered, "What the hell is happening?" But deep down, both of them already knew. That wasn't a courtroom loss. That was the opening move, and Derrick had just flipped the board. Before Portland, before the suit and the title, Derrick Thompson was just another kid trying to keep his head down in Bakersfield, California. His mother, Deirdre Thompson, worked night shifts at Mercy Hospital, and his father, when he was around, painted houses and rarely stayed long enough to leave anything behind but cigarette smoke and silence. By 12, Derrick had already learned to navigate 2 worlds, one at school where he aced spelling bees and science fairs, and one outside where he kept his eyes low when patrol cars rolled by. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he watched everything. One day in 8th grade, a teacher accused him of stealing a calculator. No one else was questioned. His locker was searched. Nothing was found. He said nothing then, but he never forgot how easily adults accepted suspicion when it was pointed at him. It wasn't rage that fueled him. It was the pattern. At 17, he earned a scholarship to UC Berkeley, majored in political science, wrote essays that cut through the noise. He didn't yell. He just laid out the facts, clean, sharp, precise. In a room full of opinions, he made silence feel like a verdict. Law school followed. Stanford. He got in without connections, without favors, just grit and focus. While others chased corporate firms and paychecks, Derrick interned with a public accountability unit in Alameda County. He sat in hearings where officers described routine stops that ended with broken ribs and bruised wrists. He logged every word. He didn't wear anger like armor. He wore patience like a weapon. At 33, Derrick was leading reviews for the Western District's Office of Civil Conduct. Quietly, case by case, he built a reputation, not a flashy one, but the kind that made departments nervous. He moved like a lawyer, thought like an analyst, and carried himself like a man who already knew what you were hiding. Portland was his first appointment as special counsel for civil accountability, a position created after years of lobbying by watchdog groups tired of internal affairs cleaning their own house. Derrick was handpicked by the state board, vetted quietly, confirmed, and he kept a low profile on purpose. He didn't tweet, he didn't lecture, he showed up. That morning outside the bakery, that wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, but it was the first time it happened after his appointment. And that mattered, because for once, he wouldn't have to file a complaint. He was the complaint. Derrick didn't want revenge. That was too small for the work he was doing. He wasn't out for dramatic showdowns. He wanted the truth exposed,
patterns that had been buried for years, hidden under the guise of routine procedures. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He simply showed them the mirror. For once, they had no choice but to look. After the incident outside the bakery, Derrick didn't call a news outlet. He didn't raise a public outcry. He called a judge. Then he called the Office of Personnel Audits. His badge wasn't brass, it was legislative, and it gave him the authority to request files, pull records, and open up cases that had been closed for years. Derrick was the last person anyone would expect to make waves in Portland's law enforcement. He wasn't looking for a battle. He was looking for a reckoning.
And for Jason and Emma, that reckoning had just begun. It wasn't about one bad arrest, it was about all of them. The countless stops, the racial profiling, the assumption that certain people didn't belong. Derrick wasn't out to tear their lives apart, but he was determined to expose the cracks in a system that had been silently doing harm for far too long. The precinct felt different now, not louder, not busier, just tense. Jason noticed it first. When he walked into the break room, conversation stopped. It wasn't a kind of silence you get when you interrupt a joke. It was the kind of silence that happens when people don't want to be heard saying the wrong thing. He grabbed his lunch from the fridge, trying to act like nothing was wrong, but something was off. Emma caught on a few hours later. She passed a conference room and saw Lieutenant Schaefer speaking in hushed tones with two men in suits. Neither man wore department badges. One had a leather folio tucked under his arm, the kind of thing federal agents always seem to carry. When Emma entered the hallway, they stopped talking. That evening, Jason got a call from his cousin who worked in Twin Falls. "Hey, you didn't cuff some guy named Thompson last week, did you?" his cousin asked. Jason's stomach dropped. Why? Because his name's bouncing around like wildfire. State Audit Board, some kind of oversight authority. The whole precinct over here is watching their reports like they're about to get audited next. Jason laughed, but it sounded forced. Nah, it's fine, just a misunderstanding. The guy got mouthy, we cleared it. But even as the words left his mouth, they didn't feel convincing. The lie didn't even sound like a lie anymore. It just sounded like denial. 2 days later, the captain called them in, not for a casual meeting, but a formal request. Full uniform, paper trail. They stepped into the captain's office and saw the same two suits from the hallway sitting across from his desk. Officers Walker and Green, Captain Rollins began, his voice clipped. "This is Mr. Granger and Miss Ozai from the Office of Civil Accountability." Miss Ozai didn't smile. She didn't blink much either. "We are opening an internal review regarding an incident that took place last Thursday morning involving Mr. Derrick Thompson." Jason's face went blank. "We've already spoken on that. He was released. Case dismissed. Nothing else happened." Granger spoke up. "The investigation goes beyond the arrest." Lynn straightened in her chair. "Excuse me, we're reviewing your history. Complaints, stops, reports filed, and those that were adjusted after the fact." Captain Rollins shifted in his seat and slid a manila folder across the desk. "You'll receive subpoenas to appear at the review hearing in 2 weeks."
Jason opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Lynn swallowed hard. "Are we being accused of something?" "Not yet," Granger said. "That's what the hearing is for." The next morning, an email landed in both of their inboxes. Subject: Case Review Summary prepared by Special Counsel D. Thompson. It had attachments, lots of them. Old stops, body cam footage, timestamps, civilian statements, things they thought no one would ever piece together. Jason's hands hovered over his keyboard for a full minute before he could bring himself to click open one of the files. It was a stop from 3 years ago. A man named Julian York, pulled over for a broken taillight, detained for non-compliance, charges dropped. The body cam footage was listed as not uploaded. The statement from York said he had been slammed against his car after asking for a supervisor. Jason remembered it, not clearly, but enough. He closed the file, his chest tight. Lynn messaged him. "Lynn, they're going to make this look like a pattern." Jason stared at the screen, his mind racing. "Brent, it is a pattern." There was a pause before she replied. "Lynn, we followed protocol." But even she didn't sound sure anymore because Keaton wasn't just coming with one story, he was bringing receipts. Jason and Lynn were finally realizing it wasn't about a cleanup job, it was an autopsy. The review hearing wasn't held at the precinct or the courthouse. It took place in a neutral municipal building off Fairview Avenue, the kind of space used for zoning meetings and forgotten city business. But on this day, every chair in the gray-walled conference room felt electric.
Jason adjusted his tie 3 times before walking in. Lynn sat in the hallway, flipping through a thin folder. She hadn't read a single page in 20 minutes. They weren't alone. At least a dozen people sat around the table. Legal observers, a member of the city's ethics board, 2 representatives from the state attorney's office. No uniforms, no familiar faces, no backup. At the head of the table sat Derrick Thompson. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier. He looked prepared. The chair next to him was filled by Miss Osai, who opened the hearing with a flat voice. This is a formal review under Article 14. Officers Walker and Green are present. Allegations concern abuse of discretionary authority and repeated misapplication of procedural stops. She turned to Derrick. Special Counsel Thompson, you have the floor. Derrick didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He just opened his folder. This won't be about accusations, he said. It'll be about patterns. He placed the document on the table. Case 1, Julian York, stopped for a broken taillight, detained for over 45 minutes, no charges.
Lynn cleared her throat. That was 3 years ago. Derrick didn't even look up. Case 2, Alan Rivers, matched the description of a robbery suspect. Same precinct, same language used in the report. Detained without probable cause, no charges. He slid another sheet forward. Case 3, same officers, same phrasing. Fit the description, suspicious behavior, non-compliant tone. Jason leaned forward. We respond to calls as they come in. We don't control the descriptions. Derrick replied evenly. But you control how long you hold someone. You control whether you check IDs or ask questions before making assumptions. You control your tone, your language, and the number of times someone with no criminal record walks away with bruises and no apology. He pulled out a printed map, marked with red pins. These are all the stops you two have conducted over the last 5 years. The pins weren't scattered. They formed clusters on specific streets in certain neighborhoods. Derrick continued, we compared your stop data to 3 other patrol teams. You average 42% more stops. 80% of those involve individuals from one demographic group. 90% result in no charges. Ms. Osai added quietly, that's not policing, that's profiling. Lynn's voice rose slightly. So what, we're on trial for doing our jobs? Responding to calls, following protocol? You're not on trial, Derrick said, his voice still steady. You're in review. A review triggered because, for once, you stopped the wrong person. Not someone with less credibility, not someone without recourse. Me. He paused, letting the words settle. I wasn't special that day. I didn't carry a badge. I was just a man outside a bakery. You decided that was enough. Jason exhaled through his nose. We had a dispatch. We didn't target you. You didn't have to, Derrick answered, his voice calm, because you've built a system where the targeting happens automatically. He looked around the room, then back at Jason and Lynn. You can't fix what you won't admit. No one spoke for a long time. The silence didn't feel victorious, it felt surgical. This wasn't revenge, it was exposure. In that room, every skipped step, every rushed report, every rolled eye over a civilian complaint came back to the surface. Because when you make the same call over and over, it stops being a mistake. It becomes who you are.
By the time the second day of the review began, Jason Walker was cracking. He walked into the room with a worn expression, looking older than usual. His eyes were dull, his jaw clenched, and his posture tighter. He didn't speak much to Lynn. He barely even looked at her. She, on the other hand, kept a calm exterior, but something in her eyes betrayed the tension. She was scanning the room too closely, reading every movement like a detective looking for clues. Derrick Thompson didn't bring fire and brimstone. He didn't raise his voice or lean in for dramatic effect. He simply stood at the center of the room with a folder in hand, edges slightly worn from use. It was clear that he had been prepared for this moment, prepared for everything that was about to unfold. I've said what I needed to say, Derrick began, his voice steady and even. You've heard from the people affected. You've seen the numbers, the language in the reports, the footage we recovered. You've heard the same phrases repeated, same methods, same faces being stopped, questioned, cuffed, and then quietly released. He glanced at Jason. "I don't believe either of you joined this department with bad intentions, but somewhere along the way, you stopped checking yourselves. You stopped seeing people and started seeing profiles." The room fell silent. It wasn't dramatic or filled with tension. It was the kind of silence that happens when a truth has been said aloud and no one can refute it. Derrick's words hung in the air like a verdict. "I'm not here to ruin your lives. That's not justice. I'm here because the system can't fix itself if it keeps protecting patterns that clearly don't work." He paused for a moment, then turned to the review board. "My recommendation is that Officers Walker and Green be removed from active duty indefinitely, pending further training, psychological review, and a complete departmental audit. I'm also requesting that the cases flagged during this review be formally reopened." Jason didn't flinch. He looked down at his shoes, hands trembling slightly, but not enough to show in his voice. He was numb. He had been in the department too long to pretend he didn't know what was coming. Lynn's expression was more guarded, but she didn't challenge Derrick's words. The weight of everything had already set in. There was no dramatic exit, no sudden anger. Just a quiet realization that this wasn't just a review. It was a reckoning. The board went into closed session, and it felt like the longest wait of Jason's life. When they returned, the decision was clear. "Officer Walker," the lead board member said, his voice authoritative and final, "you are suspended from active duty, stripped of your badge, pending reassessment." Jason's heart sank. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. The feeling of being exposed, of having no ground to stand on, pressed in on him like the walls of the room were closing in. "Officer Green," the board member continued, "same. You are suspended from active duty, pending reassessment."
Lynn didn't speak either. She just stared ahead, her lips tight, no longer smug, just rigid. There was no dramatic exit, no angry protests, no slamming chairs, just two officers who had believed for too long that their position protected them from accountability. And now, all of that had come crashing down. Derrick gathered his things quietly. He didn't glance at Jason or Lynn as he left the room. He didn't even acknowledge them. He walked out with the same controlled demeanor he had carried throughout the entire ordeal. As he passed them on his way out, Jason caught his eye for just a second. "I didn't think it would end like this," Jason muttered, barely above a whisper. Derrick paused, but only for a brief moment. He looked at Jason, but there was no anger in his expression, just a quiet understanding. "It didn't have to," Derrick replied, "but that wasn't up to me." And with that, he walked out of the room without another word. The doors closed behind him, and the silence in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. That evening, Jason packed up his locker alone. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't make any excuses. The precinct had already started to feel different. The people who once toasted him at retirement parties and year-end banquets were suddenly busy or on call. They couldn't look him in the eye anymore. He had always been insulated by his badge, but now that shield was gone. He was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. Lynn never showed up to pack her things. Word was she had taken personal leave, but no one really knew for sure. The rumors flew. Some said she was bitter, others said she was in denial. But the truth was, neither of them was ever going to be the same again. The precinct was quieter now. The usual noise, loud laughter, back and forth banter, the usual hustle and bustle, had quieted. A new poster went up in the hallway near the squad room. It read, "Civil Accountability Hotline, Confidential." Some of the rookies glanced at it longer than necessary. Maybe they saw something different, something Jason and Lynn had long forgotten. Derrick Thompson wasn't done. After Portland, he flew to another city.
The next morning, he was in a new precinct, quietly beginning another review. No headlines, no fanfare, no applause. It wasn't about recognition for him, it was about repair, real, lasting repair. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. His job wasn't to make headlines. His job was to make sure the cracks in the system didn't go unnoticed. And for those who had watched him, those who had witnessed the truth he brought into that sterile review room, something had changed. The training manual at the Portland precinct got rewritten. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Officers were now required to review real case footage, not staged examples of stops gone wrong. Derrick's case became one of them.
New recruits started asking a different question. Have you ever made a mistake and learned from it? It wasn't to shame anyone. It was to find out if someone could take accountability before they wore a badge. For Jason, the reality had sunk in. He had been suspended from active duty. He had no choice but to reflect on what had gone wrong, to confront the mistakes he had been so willing to ignore for years. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't act like the system wasn't broken. For Lynn, the silence felt louder. She had always carried herself with confidence, but now even that felt empty. She moved back to Wyoming to be closer to her sister, deactivating her social media and declining all interviews. She didn't argue with the board's findings, but neither did she fully accept them. She didn't speak out loud, but she carried her anger in silence. As for the people who had been stopped, cuffed, humiliated, and treated like suspects for no reason other than their appearance, a few received apologies. Julian York got a handwritten letter from the mayor's office. Alan Rivers received a follow-up call from the city attorney's office offering mediation. Nothing flashy, no big settlements splashed across the news, just quiet signs that something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. Justice doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it just means someone finally listens. Someone with power gets asked to answer. And the next time, maybe someone will hesitate before treating a man in a navy jacket like a suspect, before seeing him as just another profile. Because that day outside the bakery could have happened to anyone, but it happened to Derrick Thompson, a man who had spent his entire life watching people get silenced. And when it was his turn, he didn't scream, he didn't threaten. He showed them the mirror. For once, they had to look. The aftermath of the review hearings and the changes that followed rippled through Portland's law enforcement community in ways that no one had expected. People who had once seemed untouchable, officers who thought their positions protected them from accountability, were now being scrutinized in a way they hadn't been before. Even if it wasn't in the headlines, the shift was undeniable. Derrick Thompson's quiet, steady approach to reform had done more than just expose a few bad arrests. It had cracked open a system that had long been allowed to operate unchecked. The truth Derrick had fought for wasn't just about his own story or even about the two officers, Jason Walker and Lynn Green. It was about the way that systemic bias had been woven into the everyday operations of law enforcement. And once that truth was exposed, it couldn't be ignored anymore. The city of Portland as a whole started to feel a change. It wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were still officers who clung to old habits, still those who saw the new scrutiny as an attack on their entire profession. But the conversation was happening, and that was the first step. For the first time, people were starting to ask the hard questions. Who are we arresting? Why are we arresting them? What biases are we ignoring because it's easier to do so?
One afternoon, a group of young recruits walked past the squad room and paused at the new poster hanging on the wall. It read, "Civil Accountability Hotline, Confidential." It had become a symbol of the change that was slowly taking root in Portland's police department. The recruits didn't just glance at it and move on, they lingered. They took in the weight of it. They could see that things weren't the same anymore. Maybe they'd been hired to patrol the streets, but now they understood that their real job was to hold themselves accountable, to make sure they never stopped seeing the people behind the reports, behind the descriptions. Inside the precinct, Jason Walker continued to deal with the consequences of his actions. After his suspension, he took a job in the city's vehicle impound department, far removed from the action. He no longer wore a badge.
He no longer carried the sense of pride he once had in his uniform. But what stood out was how quietly he embraced his new position. There was no bitterness, no attempt to deny the truth. He didn't go out of his way to make people feel sorry for him. In a way, Jason had begun to realize something that Derrick had already known, that true accountability didn't require making grand gestures. It was about accepting the quiet, uncomfortable truths and being willing to learn from them. Lynn Green, however, disappeared from the department in a way that felt different from Jason's retreat. The whispers around the precinct suggested that she had left to be closer to family in Wyoming. No one was certain of the exact details of her departure, but her absence left a void that few could fill. Some said that her leaving was a sign of personal shame, while others believed she was simply retreating to lick her wounds. She didn't return calls from former colleagues. She didn't show up to the department's quarterly meetings. The ones who spoke about her did so in hushed tones, as if they weren't sure whether she would ever return or whether she ever would be the same if she did. But even as Lynn faded from the department, the culture continued to change. New recruits, like the ones who noticed the civil accountability poster, weren't just being trained to uphold the law, they were being taught to question their assumptions. They were learning to question themselves. Meanwhile, Derrick continued his work across the state. He moved quietly from city to city, from precinct to precinct, working in the background, ensuring that departments that had long been protected from scrutiny would no longer be allowed to remain hidden. His work wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to make headlines or score political points. Derrick wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need applause. He just needed to make sure the system would start looking at itself in the mirror. But even with Derrick's efforts, the work wasn't done. The cracks Derrick had exposed in Portland were not unique to just that department. They existed in systems all across the country, built into the fabric of law enforcement at large. And while Portland had begun the painful process of self-reflection, it was still just a start. Other cities, other precincts would need their own reckoning. The work was far from over. Derrick knew that. He knew it wasn't going to be a quick fix. There would be days where the system would push back. But every day, more people were waking up to the truth of what was happening. The patterns were being exposed, and that was something they couldn't ignore anymore.
He'd never sought fame, and he certainly didn't seek to be a hero. He was simply doing the job that needed to be done, challenging those who had the power to hide behind their badges and ensuring that, eventually, they would be held accountable. For Derrick, it wasn't about one case, one arrest, or even one police department. It was about changing the mindset. He wanted to make sure that when someone received a call with a vague description, when an officer saw a person in a navy jacket, they would pause. They would check the facts. They would make sure they weren't acting on assumptions and biases that had been ingrained in them over the years. Because that was the lesson. Things weren't always as simple as they seemed. There was more to every story, more to every person. And when you stopped seeing people as just profiles, when you took the time to really see them, you didn't just change your job, you changed your life. As months passed, the department in Portland continued its slow but steady transformation. The wake of Derrick Thompson's visit to the city had left a lasting impact that could be felt in the smallest moments. Conversations in the hallways, a shift in tone during roll calls, and even the way officers responded to the public. While the larger, more dramatic shifts that Derrick hoped for were still a long way off, the city had begun to face itself. The law enforcement community knew it was under the microscope now, and that scrutiny, though uncomfortable, was exactly what it needed to start healing. Jason Walker, still working in the impound department, had moments where the weight of his decisions hit him hardest. He saw officers come and go, rookies stepping into the precinct with optimism and fresh ideas. He noticed how they looked at the old ways differently, with a quiet sense of accountability that hadn't been there before. Jason, too, started to look at the world differently. Every day he walked past the office where he used to sit, where he used to make decisions without question. He couldn't help but reflect on everything that had changed. For better or for worse, his career had been altered irreversibly. But there was a quiet part of him that felt a slight relief. The shield was gone, yes, but it had also freed him from a system that had allowed him to overlook the very real consequences of his actions. It was a humbling experience, the kind that forces you to reconsider everything. For Jason, it wasn't about seeking redemption, it was about living in a new kind of truth. The old certainties had evaporated,
and in their place, there was a more complex reality, one that had room for mistakes, but also for growth. Lynn Green's absence from the precinct became a quiet legend in its own right. No one talked about her departure openly, but whispers filled the gaps. Some said she couldn't handle the weight of what had been exposed. Others speculated that the reality of her involvement in the systematic issues had shaken her to the core. Some officers, especially those who had been close to her, began to ask themselves how much they had overlooked over the years. Lynn had been a great officer. She had been driven, ambitious, and had always followed protocol. But protocol wasn't enough anymore, and that realization had crushed her certainty. Lynn's departure wasn't dramatic. There were no press conferences, no media appearances. She simply left. But when she did, she left behind a department that was now thinking more deeply about what it meant to serve the public and to wear a badge. The culture was shifting, and though it wasn't easy for everyone, it was happening.
Meanwhile, Derrick continued his quiet, relentless journey. He moved to another city, another department, always keeping his focus on the bigger picture. He wasn't interested in accolades or recognition. He knew that real change didn't come from grand gestures or speeches. It came from the painstaking, often invisible work of peeling back the layers of a system built on assumptions and biases. He wasn't a hero, but he had become a symbol of something much bigger. He represented the possibility of real reform. His work wasn't about pointing fingers or tearing people down. It was about exposing patterns, revealing uncomfortable truths, and offering people the chance to see the system for what it truly was, not what they had been taught to believe. In his work, Derrick found a new kind of fulfillment, one that wasn't about fame or even immediate results. It was about the long game. It was about ensuring that in the future, officers would have the tools and the perspective to challenge their own biases before making decisions that could ruin someone's life. His job wasn't about holding bad officers accountable. It was about making sure good officers never became complacent in a broken system. In Portland, the changes Derrick had set in motion slowly spread to other departments. The work was difficult and uncomfortable. Some days, it felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the awareness had been raised, the conversations were happening, and that, in itself, was progress. The new recruits were different. They had been trained to question, to think critically about their role in society, and to challenge the patterns they were inheriting. They didn't just patrol the streets, they understood the weight of their decisions. They knew that their job wasn't just about upholding the law, it was about upholding justice. And though Derrick had long since left Portland, his influence remained in the quiet conversations between officers, in the departments that had re-examined their policies, in the new recruits who had learned from his example. It was a quiet revolution, but it was one that had started to take root. As for the people who had been caught in the crosshairs of bias, those who had been stopped, humiliated, and treated as suspects for no reason other than the way they looked, some of them received apologies. Not all, but some. Julian York received a handwritten letter from the mayor's office. Alan Rivers, who had been mistakenly detained while walking home with groceries, was contacted by the city attorney, offering mediation. These gestures were quiet, but they mattered. They weren't about making headlines. They were about acknowledging the pain that had been caused and working to make things right, even if just a little bit. And for Derrick, that was enough. The work wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about getting applause or public recognition. It was about ensuring that the system didn't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. It was about making sure that one day, officers would pause before making assumptions based on someone's appearance. It was about creating a future where bias wasn't just accepted part of the job, it was a problem to be solved. Derrick's work was far from over. He would continue to travel, continue to review cases, continue to hold those in power accountable. But as he moved forward, he knew that the system was already beginning to change. It was slow, it was painful, but it was happening. And that was the most important part of all. Lessons learned. The story of Derrick Thompson's quiet yet powerful challenge to the Portland Police Department
teaches us valuable lessons about accountability, bias, and the importance of self-reflection. One key lesson is that true change often begins with discomfort. Derrick didn't seek revenge, he sought truth. And in doing so, he forced people to confront uncomfortable patterns that had been ignored for too long. Accountability doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's a quiet, steady force that slowly exposes hidden truths. Another important takeaway is that we must challenge our assumptions, whether in law enforcement or everyday life. When we stop seeing people as individuals and begin to treat them as stereotypes or profiles, we not only harm others, but we also perpetuate systemic biases. The story reminds us that personal growth is tied to the willingness to listen and learn from past mistakes. Derrick's journey shows that real progress happens when we acknowledge our flaws and work to correct them, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good. By questioning our actions and motives, we contribute to a world where fairness and empathy shape our systems, relationships, and decisions.
If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.